Chapter 5. Battle Lessons. The morning light filtered through the hidden grove, catching dust motes that swirled in the air like tiny sparks of mana. Rowan stood in the center of the craterscape, his great sword raised high, his body moving through a sequence of swings that had become his morning ritual. Each strike carried the weight of years of training, each follow-through precise and deliberate. He cycled through his weapons without pause, great sword to long sword to short sword to spear, the transition between each one fluid despite the awkwardness that still marked his form. With each weapon, he pushed his mana through the steel, trying to forge that connection Gran had described. The great sword felt closest to an extension of his body now, the mana flowing down the length of the blade with growing ease. A faint blue shimmer traced the fuller of the blade, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The long and short swords were improving too, his grip finding the rhythm of their different balances. The spear required a different approach entirely, its reach demanding he extend his perception further than his muscle memory wanted to allow, his mana thread stretching thin at the tip like a bowstring, drawn to its limit. Beside him, Wyatt worked with equal intensity on his short sword and twin daggers. His movements were smaller, more focused, but no less determined. He could feel the mana wrapping around his weapons with more consistency each day, the connection growing stronger and more natural. Each time he drew his daggers, he could sense the mana threads unspooling from his core, threading along the blade edges like silver wire drawn through a needle. His daggers, in particular, were becoming an extension of his hands, each flick of his wrist carrying the same precision he applied to his spell weaving. Both boys were riding the edge of something new. It was the thrill of pushing against a threshold, of feeling the shape of a breakthrough opening up before them. They trained with the focused energy of young warriors who knew they were standing on the brink of a change. By mid-morning, Sen and Gran had finished packing the supplies needed for the expedition. The distance to the Orc encampment was not far, and since the mercenaries would handle the bulk of the work, they felt it was safe enough to bring Rowan and Wyatt along. This would be a rare opportunity, a live lesson in tactics, strategy, and the realities of a large-scale subjugation that no training session in the Grove could ever replicate. Gran found the boys still training when he came to check on them. He stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, watching them move through their sequences. They had listened well to his instructions. They were moving each weapon the way he had demonstrated. They were nowhere near the level of mastery he expected, but the progress was unmistakable. Their sparring attempts were comical in their awkwardness. They tried to test their mana wrapping with light strikes against each other, but the connections were still too new, too uncertain. The weapons moved with the hesitant grace of people learning a new language, each swing carrying more hope than conviction. When their blades met, the mana shimmers flickered and died, the steel clanging with a dull ring, rather than the resonant hum Gran had shown them. Gran could not help but laugh. The sound rolled through the clearing, warm and genuine. Rowan heard it and straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "We would have been experts if you had allowed us to use and train with weapons sooner." Gran's smile faded into something firmer, the expression of a man who had made decisions he knew were right, even when they were hard. He walked toward the boys, his boots silent on the scarred earth. "I have seen powerful knights that were too dependent on their weapons fall, when their weapons were shattered, dropped, or taken. I have also seen mages killed when their mana wanes, or their ward shields break." He paused, letting the words settle. This is why your mother and I have drilled into you the ability to fight without weapons. This is so that even unarmed, you will be able to attack and defend without the need for a weapon. A weapon is another layer on top of the abilities that you have earned. It is not a replacement for them. The boys absorbed the lesson, their earlier excitement tempered by the gravity of their father's words. Rowan nodded slowly, already understanding the truth in them. Wyatt's eyes flickered with the spark of new understanding, his mind already cataloguing the implications. "Go back and rest," Gran told them. "Tomorrow we all set off with the mercenary group. You will need your strength." The next morning, the family met the mercenary group on the outskirts of Willow's Hollow. The boys immediately noticed the flags raised and attached to the wagons the mercenaries would ride in. Each flag bore the same design, a dark green background with an image of a brown-grey toad smoking a long, thin, curved pipe. "What are the flags for?" Wyatt asked, pointing at the nearest banner. Will, who had been giving last-minute instructions to the company, turned at their question. "The flag represents my mercenary group. We are called the Toad Mercenaries, and we are quite well known in the area around the city of Nolan." His smile was easy, the kind of pride that came from years of earning a reputation in the field. Gran and Zen climbed onto one of the open wagons with Rowan and Wyatt. The wagon lurched forward, and the group departed Willow's Hollow, rolling toward the foothills northeast, where the orc and goblin encampment lay waiting. They traveled at a deliberate pace, slow enough that scouts could move ahead of the main group and alert them to any threats. The journey would take about 4 hours to reach their chosen staging area, a campsite selected for its tactical advantages. The terrain between Willow's Hollow and the foothills was broken ground, ravines cutting through the earth, scattered boulders creating natural cover, thick brush that would hide their approach from the enemy's view. When they reached the staging area, the mercenaries made camp and immediately began reviewing the attack plan. Will gathered his commanders, spreading a crude map across a flat rock and pointing out the routes, positions, and timing. Zen and Gran listened from the edge of the group, their eyes tracking the same terrain Gran had scouted days earlier. While the adults planned, Rowan and Wyatt wandered the camp, taking in the sights and atmosphere of a proper mercenary encampment. It was nothing like the quiet rhythms of Willow's Hollow. Here, warriors moved with purpose, their conversations heavy with the language of combat. One figure caught Wyatt's attention immediately. A man was setting up something at the edge of the camp, his hands moving through patterns that made Wyatt's mana sense tingle. The man was placing an object into the ground at the center of a circle, then weaving his hands in complex sequences as mana flowed from his body into the object and expanded outward. Wyatt felt his fascination surge. He began watching the man closely, tracking how he used mana to change the perception of the campsite for anyone outside it. The subtle shifts, the careful layering of enchantments, the precision of his work. It was magic, unlike anything Wyatt had seen before. He could see the mana threads weaving through the air, each one a different color and thickness, braiding together into a complex lattice that pulsed with a low hum only he could feel. The man noticed the boys' quiet observation. He smiled, turned to face the boys, and waved them over. Wyatt looked at Rowan with an excited smile. "I have to know what he's doing." He started walking toward the man before Rowan could respond. Rowan sighed, but followed along. "Hello there, young lads," the man said as they approached. "As you can see, I am a mage belonging to the Toads." He noticed the look in Wyatt's eyes and smiled wider. "I see you've got questions." He chuckled. "I see our vice leader has taken a liking to you, and I can see why now." He ran through a quick explanation of the formation magic he specialized in. He used an anchor, usually an object that could contain mana, as the central point where the formation activated. From that point, mana was added and pushed outward, shaped into what he wanted. In this case, a thin shield designed to deceive the eyes, ears, and other senses of anyone outside the formation. The camp was not just hidden. It was made to feel like nothing was there at all. Wyatt's mind raced as he grasped the concept. But what about the scouts outside? He asked quickly. If the formation hides everything, how do the scouts find their way in and out? Very good question, the man said, clearly pleased. The answer is that their job is to stay outside and quietly deal with unwanted things that could give away our position. With that, he excused himself to continue his work. The boys looked around the camp a bit more, taking in the sights, the sounds, the atmosphere of a mercenary group preparing for battle. Then they went back to find their parents, in conversation about the next day's raid. Wyatt told Zen about meeting the man and the formation he had observed. Then, still concerned about the scouts, he asked, "I hope the scouts are okay." Zen smiled at her son's thoughtfulness. She explained that the man had neglected to mention that the scouts had a key to find and bypass the formation if they needed to. He might not have mentioned it because he was busy, or most likely by choice. The morning of the attack arrived with a cold, clear sky. Will stood at the front of the company and gave quick, precise instructions. They would attack from the ridge side furthest away from Willow's Hollow. It was the direction the orcs and goblins would least expect, their scouts looking west toward the village, not east toward the high ground. The company moved silently through the broken terrain, using ravines and scattered boulders for cover. The thick brush made progress slow but gave them concealment. Will led with his scouts ahead, picking their way through the undergrowth with practiced caution. They reached the edge of the monster encampment, and Will signaled a halt. The camp sprawled below them in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. Orcs and goblins moved between crude shelters, patrols walking the perimeter. The air carried the stench of roasting meat and unwashed bodies, thick enough to taste. Will decided he would handle the 2 inner lookout positions himself. He stepped forward, and the boys watched with growing fascination as he began to diffuse his mana, then change its nature. It was similar to what Wyatt had observed with the formation mage, but applied to himself rather than a location. Will's presence shifted, his form blurring at the edges until he faded from sight entirely and disappeared. Rowan and Wyatt could still feel Will's mana, but they could no longer see or hear him. They tracked his mana signature as he moved, a ghost slipping through the camp. Moments later, the 2 forward goblin lookouts simply fell, their bodies dropping without a sound. A moment after that, Will silently reappeared beside the group, as though he had never left. A single drop of blood traced the edge of his blade, the only evidence of his passage. Rowan and Wyatt were amazed. It was another new way to use mana that they had not encountered or considered before. Stealth as a knight specialization, applied not just to movement, but to complete sensory elimination. Will signaled the group to move forward. The mercenaries approached the edge of the orc encampment, and Will gave a series of hand signals. The members responded with their own, a silent language of coordinated violence. Several mercenaries, along with Will, faded and disappeared. The others pulled out their weapons or began preparing spells. Zen, Gran, Rowan and Wyatt stayed toward the back of the group, observing. The main attack erupted without warning. Guttural screams tore through the camp as the stealth mercenaries dispatched the patrols and moved inward. The remaining mercenaries rushed into the encampment, weapons drawn, spells ready. The formation mage threw an object like a black rock toward the far end of the encampment. He motioned with his hands and cast, and from the rock, dark smoke erupted, spreading rapidly to cover the entire back area, where a large group of orcs and goblins had gathered. The smoke did not merely obscure, it clung to the mind as well as the eyes, a viscous grey fog that seeped into the senses and twisted them. Orcs within it swung their weapons at empty air. Goblins scrambled in circles. The battle cries that might have rallied the monsters were smothered before they could travel more than a few yards. Everywhere, frenzied combat erupted. The different fighting styles of the mercenary knights were on full display. Two Force Knights mowed down groups of orcs and goblins, their strikes carrying projected kinetic force that sent bodies flying. Each time a Force Knight's weapon connected, a visible wave of distorted air rippled outward from the impact point, lifting creatures off their feet and hurling them through crude wooden shelters that splintered like kindling. The Stealth Knights moved with superhuman speed, attacking and retreating in quick succession, each new strike occurring before the last enemy had even hit the ground. They left trails of shimmering afterimages in their wake, their blades flashing in arcs of silver. Mercenary mages cast elemental attacks or raised shields to stop thrown axes and spears. One mage sent a whip of crimson fire coiling through the air, wrapping around 3 goblins, who shrieked as the flames consumed their crude armor. Another mage slammed his palm into the earth, sending a fissure of compacted stone erupting beneath a group of charging orcs. Gran estimated at least 40 to 60 orcs, and about twice that number of goblins in the camp. It was a significant force, and the mercenaries were handling it well, but Zen sensed something wrong. She looked to the right of the encampment, toward the hut that had yet to be reached by the battle. An arm reached out from the hut, an orc arm, decorated with animal teeth and bird skulls wrapped around the wrist and forearm as bracelets. The arm held a staff carved from black bone, and the arm pointed to the sky as the orc shaman stepped out of the hut, flanked by 2 orc chieftains. A flash erupted from the shaman's staff. Then sharp ice projectiles rained down on the battlefield. The projectiles fell with devastating speed and force, each one the size of a fist and sharpened to a needle point. They struck without discrimination. Mercenaries, orcs, and goblins were impaled in an instant. The ground around the shaman pocked and cracked as the ice hammered the earth, sending shards of frozen earth and ice shrapnel flying in every direction. Those who could react fast enough threw up ward shields, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. Knights and mages who could not react fast enough were taken down by the fast-falling hail, their bodies crumpling as ice pierced through steel and flesh alike. "Orc shaman!" Will shouted. All the mercenaries reacted immediately, gathering together with their nearest members, forming a tight defensive cluster just in time. The 2 orc chieftains leapt into battle, both carrying power equivalent to a Tier 3 knight. Their massive cleaver-like weapons arced through the air as they struck the mercenary formation. Each swing left a visible trail of compressed mana, a crescent-shaped ripple in the air that cut through everything in its path. Shield spells buckled and cracked under the chieftain's assault, their luminous surfaces spiderwebbing with fractures before shattering in bursts of scattered light. Lesser mercenary knights were sent flying by the impact force, their bodies cartwheeling through the air before slamming into the ground. The energy carried by the chieftain's swings sliced through other fighting orcs and goblins indiscriminately. These orcs did not care about allies. The force of their attacks cut friend and foe alike. More ice projectiles slammed into the battlefield. The shaman's staff glowed with an eerie blue light between each volley, the bone carving pulsing as if alive. 2 more mercenary knights and a mage were hit, their bodies crumpling under the shaman's relentless bombardment. Will, using his speed, engaged one of the orc chieftains. He moved like a striking serpent, compressed mana propelling him in bursts that made him appear in multiple places at once. His blade flashed in a dozen locations simultaneously, each strike finding gaps in the chieftain's guard. But the chieftain's cleaver-like weapons created a deadly zone of destruction around him. Every time Will struck and withdrew, the chieftain's sweeping counterblades carved through the space Will had just occupied, the compressed mana trails intersecting and sparking where Will's afterimages had been. Will was forced to redirect his energy, his stealth-based power less effective against an opponent who fought with area denial rather than precision. The 2 commanders, Mara and Torren, were fast approaching the other chieftain. Mara moved with a warrior's economy of motion, her blade tracing tight, efficient arcs that met the chieftain's massive swings with sparks of steel on steel. Torren fought differently, his stocky frame anchoring him as he used his body like a battering ram, each step driving forward with the weight of a charging bull. Between them, their coordinated strikes were wounding the chieftain, but the monster's raw power kept them at bay. Will's strikes bit deep, but could not find a killing blow. Mara and Torren's coordination was excellent, but insufficient against an opponent who could shrug off wounds that would fell lesser fighters. Zen and Gran looked at each other. Both knew immediately that they had to step in. The cost of hesitation was measured in the bodies already falling around them. Gran told Rowan and Wyatt to stay back and stay safe. They had come trusting in the strength of the mercenaries, but it was clear they would have to intervene to avoid disaster. The boys nodded in understanding, though their eyes burned with the desire to fight. Gran pointed toward the orc shaman as their target. Zen agreed without hesitation. Zen wove a protective ward over them both as they stepped into battle. The ward shimmered around their forms, a luminous barrier that pulsed with her archmage power. It was not a single shield but a layered construction, an inner layer of kinetic dispersion that would absorb blunt force, a middle layer of thermal reflection that would dissipate heat and cold, and an outer layer of mana distortion that bent incoming spells off course. Together, they formed a dome of interlocking light that hummed with contained power. Rowan and Wyatt watched for the first time the full strength of their parents on display. It was a far cry from the power used in their training sessions. This was the power that had survived Gracespire Pass. This was the power of a Force Knight and an Archmage united. Zen sent out arcs of lightning across the distance between them and the orc shaman. The lightning did not travel in straight lines. It split and branched, seeking paths through the enemy ranks, arcing from orc to orc in a web of crackling blue-white energy. Each bolt split into 3 or 4 branches before it struck, multiplying its reach until the entire space between Zen and the shaman was a storm of lightning. The ground smoked where the bolts struck, and the enemies in her path fell back in terror. Gran charged forward, his diffused mana amplifying his speed, covering the distance in a few devastating strides. Each footfall drove a crater into the earth behind him, the ground cracking in a radial pattern from the force of his passage. He attacked with a power-infused sword, each step driving him like a living siege engine toward the shaman's position. The air ahead of him compressed into a visible cone of distortion, the pressure of his advance parting the smoke and debris like a ship's bow through water. The shaman met Gran's attack with a ward shield cast in an instant. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, cracking the earth outward in a radial pattern that extended 30 yards in every direction. The shaman's ward held, but only barely, its surface glowing white-hot at the point of impact, before dimming to a sickly green as the shaman poured more mana into it. The force of the blow drove the shaman's feet deep into the earth, his heels carving furrows as he was pushed backward. Zen and Gran engaged the orc shaman together, their combined strength pressing against the shaman's defenses. Zen wove binding spells that lashed at the shaman from multiple angles simultaneously. Thick cords of luminous energy erupted from the ground beneath him, from the air above him, from the sides, each one snapping taut, like the whips of a multi-armed deity. The bindings wrapped around his limbs and torso, pulling him in opposing directions, forcing him to divide his attention between maintaining his ward and breaking free. Gran pressed the physical assault, his sword striking the shaman's ward with relentless force. Each blow came faster than the last, the rhythm of his strikes building like a drum roll. The ward surface flared with each impact, glowing brighter and brighter, until it was a blinding sphere of light around the shaman. But with each strike, the sphere grew thinner, its luminance dimming as the shaman's mana depleted. The shaman fought back with fury. Ice projectiles erupted from his staff in rapid succession, each one larger than the last, growing to the size of boulders before launching at Zen's ward. The first impact against her barrier sounded like a thunderclap, the ward flaring brilliantly at the point of contact, before dispersing the force outward in a ring of shimmering energy. The second and third bolts struck simultaneously, the combined force driving Zen's boots backward through the dirt, her ward holding but groaning under the strain. He threw bolts of dark energy that Gran deflected with his sword, the impact driving Gran's boots deep into the earth. The dark energy crackled and hissed as it met the steel, spreading across the blade's surface in tendrils of shadow that burned cold. Gran grunted, his arms trembling as he redirected each bolt skyward, where it dissipated in a shower of black sparks. The shaman's ward absorbed Gran's strikes and redistributed the force, but Zen's binding spells were weakening its structure, thread by thread. She could see it in the mana patterns. The shaman's defensive weave was fraying at the junctions where her bindings anchored, the threads growing thin and brittle under the constant tension. She adjusted her approach, shifting her lightning into a focused beam rather than scattered arcs. The concentrated charge hammered a single point on the ward, heating it until it glowed cherry red, then cooling it rapidly with a counterspell of frost. The thermal cycling sent hairline fractures racing across the ward's surface. It took time. It took everything they had. But together, Zen and Gran blocked and wore down the shaman's attacks. Her wards absorbed the worst of his counterstrikes, while Gran's relentless pressure found the cracks in his defense. Finally, with a combined assault, Zen's lightning and Gran's kinetic strike pierced through the shaman's ward. The lightning struck first, a single blinding bolt that sealed the fractures Zen had created. Then Gran's sword followed, driving through the weakened ward like a battering ram through a shattered door. The kinetic force exploded outward in a ring of compressed air that knocked every creature within 20 yards off their feet. The shaman fell, his staff clattering from his grasp, the bone carvings splintering on the ground. Gran and Zen turned to help Will, who was furiously engaged with one of the orc chieftains. Will's speed was unmatched. He carved deep wounds into the chieftain's sides, his blade flashing in a blur of silver strikes. But the chieftain's cleaver-like weapons spun around him like a shield, preventing Will from inflicting a fatal strike. Gran's intervention turned the tide. A power-infused strike from Gran drove the chieftain back, creating an opening for Will to exploit. Will struck with the force of a coiled spring released, his speed-enhanced blow finding the chieftain's exposed side. The blade bit deep, and the chieftain roared in pain and rage. But it was not enough. The monster's thick hide and layered armor absorbed the blow, and it raised its cleaver for a killing swing. Zen arrived next, her lightning arcing from her fingertips into the chieftain's exposed wound. The current ran through the monster's body, its muscles seizing as green-tinged sparks leaped from its flesh. The chieftain staggered, its swing going wide, and Gran pressed the advantage. His sword came down in a vertical arc that split the chieftain's weapon in two, the cleaver shattering into pieces of enchanted steel that scattered across the ground. Will followed with a second strike, his blade finding the gap between the chieftain's shoulder and neck. The chieftain fell to one knee, then collapsed forward, its massive body shaking the earth as it hit the ground. Meanwhile, Mara and Torin were wounding the other orc chieftain, but still fighting hard. Gran, Zen, and Will converged on the last chieftain. The combined assault of 5 powerful fighters was overwhelming. Gran's strength shattered the chieftain's guard. Zen's lightning ran through the gaps in its armor. Will's speed let him strike from angles the chieftain could not track. Mara and Torin's coordinated strikes kept the monster constantly off balance. The last orc chieftain fell, its body joining the others in the blood-soaked earth. The remaining orcs and goblins, seeing the fall of their leaders, began to panic. The coordinated resistance that had held the mercenaries at bay dissolved into chaos. Orcs who had been fighting with ferocity now dropped their weapons and fled into the forest. Goblins scattered in every direction, their shrill cries of terror cutting through the battlefield's din. The mercenaries, sensing the shift, increased their attack pressure. Orcs and goblins were cut down by the mercenary knights' swords and spears, by the mages' elemental attacks. Fire and lightning swept through the fleeing monsters, and the subjugation was over. The Toad mercenaries, with the help of Gran and Zen, were victorious. Dead orcs and goblins lay everywhere, across the camp. The mission was a success, but the cost was real. 2 mercenary knights of Tier 2 capability had been killed by the combined attacks of the orc chieftains and shaman. 3 more knights and 2 mages were seriously wounded, their bodies bearing the marks of the chieftain's cleaver strikes and the shaman's ice. Rowan and Wyatt felt a deep unease as they witnessed the aftermath. The battle had been fierce, and the cost of victory was written in the bodies of the fallen and the groans of the wounded. But they were able to help, dragging dead orcs and goblins into piles alongside the mercenaries. The corpses were burned, except for the bodies of the orc shaman and the 2 orc chieftains. Rowan asked why those 3 were not being burned. Will explained that the bodies of high-level beasts and monsters like them contained a hardened mana core. These cores were valuable and could be processed into various mana-infused items. They were a prize worth preserving. Rowan and Wyatt stood among the smouldering remains, their minds racing. They had seen the way the mercenaries, both knights and mages, used their mana in battle. They had seen tactics, coordination, specialization, paths of power that opened up beyond what Willow's Hollow could teach. They had seen their parents not holding back, fighting with the full power that had survived wars. The chieftain's cleaver strikes, the shaman's thermal cycling wards, Will's sensory elimination stealth, the formation mage's anchor-based deception. Each was a door to knowledge they did not yet have access to. Rowan looked down at his hands, still trembling faintly from the adrenaline, and thought about the gaps between where he was and where he needed to be. Wyatt stared at the smouldering pyres and calculated what those hardened cores would mean if he could harvest them properly, once his core expanded enough to process them without burning them. There would be a lot to think about on the journey back.